The summer of 1243 arrived in Anatolia the way all catastrophes do. Quietly, without warning, wrapped in the ordinary beauty of a clear June morning. The sun rose over the eastern highlands as it had risen 10,000 times before, painting the rocky slopes of the Köse Dağ pass in shades of amber and gold, warming the stones that shepherds had walked for centuries, illuminating a landscape that had no idea it was about to be torn apart forever. The air smelled of dry grass and horse sweat, and the particular metallic tension that collects in a valley when 80,000 men are holding their breath at the same time. It was June 26th, 1243. The pass of Köse Dağ, tucked between the cities of Sivas and Erzincan in the northeastern highlands of Anatolia, and stretched across the ridgelines, banners snapping in a wind that seemed almost reluctant to blow, stood the assembled might of the Sultanate of Rum, the most powerful Islamic state in the known Western world, the inheritors of the great Seljuk tradition, the men who had humbled the Byzantine Empire at Manzikert and built a civilization from its ruins. 80,000 strong they came, like a jeweled serpent coiled across a mountain, their armor catching the early light, their horses bred for war, their commanders proud with the confidence of men who had never imagined what losing felt like. Across the valley, waiting with the particular stillness of predators who have already decided how this ends, sat 30,000 Mongols. 30,000 against 80,000. By every calculation that military commanders had used for 5 centuries, this should not have been a contest. It was not a contest. But here is what no chronicle written in the immediate aftermath of that terrible day bothered to record. Because no chronicler understood it yet. Because the truly important consequences of Köse Dağ would not become visible for decades, and would not become undeniable for a century. The real story of what happened on that June morning in 1243 was not about who won. It was not even about who lost. The real story, the hidden story, is about what the losing unleashed. About the chain of events that the Mongol hammer set in motion when it shattered the Seljuk world into 1,000 fragments, scattering people and power and possibility in all directions, particularly westward, toward a thin strip of Byzantine frontier that nobody powerful cared about. The stakes on that June morning were enormous. At the tactical level, a mountain pass. At the strategic level, the entire heartland of Anatolia. At the civilizational level, the future of the Islamic world itself. Because if the Seljuks fell, nothing stood between the Mongols and Baghdad. And nothing stood between Baghdad and the end of an age. Every one of those stakes was real. Every one of those stakes collapsed exactly as the pessimists feared. And yet, from that collapse, from the rubble and the refugees of the refugees, from the displaced warriors and the uprooted tribes and the holy men without homes and the soldiers without commanders, there emerged something that nobody planned, nobody predicted, and nobody in 1243 would have believed possible. There emerged the Ottoman Empire. 600 years of history, 3 continents under one banner. The last great caliphate of the Islamic world. Born not despite the Mongol devastation, but because of it, fertilized by it, shaped by it in ways so precise and so unlikely that they defy coincidence and demand explanation. This is that explanation. To understand what the Mongols destroyed, you first have to understand what they found. And what they found in Anatolia in the 1240s was not a broken, struggling civilization clinging to the edges of survival. What they found was a world at the height of its confidence. A world that had spent a century and a half building something genuinely remarkable. A world that had no reason to suspect the ground was about to disappear beneath its feet. The Sultanate of Rum had been born from catastrophe. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, the Seljuk Turks had shattered the Byzantine army so completely, so unexpectedly, that the Byzantine emperor himself was taken prisoner. The first time in 5 centuries that had happened. In the chaos that followed, waves of Turkic nomads poured into Anatolia, filling the vacuum left by Byzantine collapse, establishing settlements and towns, and eventually a functioning state. The Seljuks named their new kingdom Rum, the Turkish word for Rome, because this had been Roman land, and because the Seljuks understood that naming something is how you claim it. By the early 13th century, the Sultanate of Rum was no longer a nomadic band making do on borrowed territory. It was a sophisticated, prosperous, cosmopolitan state. Under Sultan Kaikubad I, who ruled from 1220 to 1237, Rum reached the peak of its power. Trade flowed through the ports of Antalya on the Mediterranean and Sinope on the Black Sea. Caravanserais, the great roadside inns that facilitated commerce, dotted the landscape at regular intervals, paid for by the Sultan, maintained by the state, welcoming merchants from Persia, Syria, Egypt, and the Italian city-states with equal courtesy. The architecture was extraordinary. The Sultanate built mosques and madrasas and hospitals that combined Seljuk geometric traditions with Persian elegance and echoes of Byzantine craftsmanship, creating something entirely new and entirely beautiful. Konya, the capital, was a city of scholars and poets and theologians, a place where ideas competed as vigorously as merchants. This was what Rum was. This is what it felt like to live there in the years before everything changed. To be part of a civilization that had mastered its corner of the world, that had made peace with its neighbors on most fronts, that faced the future with the particular confidence of states that have survived long enough to think they understand how survival works. Far to the southeast, separated from Rum by the mountains and deserts of Syria and Iraq, stood the other great pillar of the medieval Islamic world, Baghdad. The city that Caliph al-Mansur had built in 762 as a perfect circle, cosmological ambition made into brick and mortar, had been the beating heart of Islamic civilization for nearly 5 centuries. At its height, in the 10th and 11th centuries, Baghdad was arguably the largest city on earth, home to more than 1 million people, centre of the Abbasid Caliphate that claimed spiritual authority over Muslims from Spain to Central Asia. The caliphs of Baghdad were not powerful in the military sense. Real power had long since passed to Turkish sultans and Persian viziers. But they held something more durable than armies. They held legitimacy. They were the successors of the Prophet, the commanders of the faithful, the anchors of a religious and political order that the Islamic world organized itself around. The House of Wisdom had made Baghdad a beacon of learning that the medieval world had no parallel for. Here, scholars translated Aristotle and Plato and Euclid into Arabic, preserving Greek thought that Europe had largely forgotten. Here, mathematicians invented algebra and refined astronomy. Here, physicians developed surgical techniques and pharmacological knowledge that would not be surpassed in Europe for 300 years. Baghdad was not simply a capital city. It was an idea. The idea that Islam and knowledge and civilization were the same thing, pointing in the same direction, building toward the same destination. The Abbasid Caliph in 1243 was al-Mustasim, the 37th in his line, a man of learning and genuine piety, who was also, by most accounts, catastrophically unsuited to the moment in which history had placed him.
He was intelligent enough to understand theology, but not pragmatic enough to understand power. He trusted in the accumulated prestige of 5 centuries of caliphal authority to deter enemies, the way a lion's reputation deters other animals. He had not yet learned that reputation does not stop arrows. And then there was Byzantium, the once mighty Eastern Roman Empire, which had held Anatolia for centuries before Manzikert, which had survived Huns and Avars and Bulgars and Arabs and Crusaders, was, in 1243, a shadow empire, nursing its wounds from a wound that had nothing to do with the Seljuks or the Mongols. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade, an army of Western Christians theoretically marching to liberate Jerusalem, had instead turned and sacked Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, dividing the empire among Latin lords who had no idea how to govern what they had seized. The Byzantine successor states, the Empire of Nicaea in western Anatolia, the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast, were slowly rebuilding, dreaming of reclaiming their capital, distracted by their own internal competitions, not paying nearly enough attention to what was happening on their eastern frontiers. This, then, was the world of Anatolia in 1240. 3 civilizations, Rum, Abbasid, Byzantine, each powerful in its own right, each absorbed in its own concerns, each failing to grasp the nature of what was coming from the east with the patience and inevitability of geological change. Now understand what was coming. Genghis Khan had died in 1227, but death did not stop what he had started. The Mongol Empire he built was the largest contiguous land empire in human history, and it was still growing. He had not created simply an army, he had created a system, a method of conquest and control so efficient and so ruthless that it operated like a machine, processing civilizations the way a millstone processes grain. Genghis had understood something that most conquerors before him had not. That the most powerful weapon is not the cavalry charge or the siege engine, but the reputation that precedes them. He cultivated terror as policy. Cities that surrendered immediately were treated with relative leniency, taxed, garrisoned, incorporated into the Mongol administrative structure. Cities that resisted were annihilated, not simply defeated, annihilated. Their populations killed or enslaved, their walls demolished, their agricultural systems destroyed, their very existence erased from the landscape. The lesson was meant to be heard in the next city before the Mongol army arrived. It almost always was. After Genghis, his successors continued the expansion with mechanical precision. Under Urgedei Khan, the Mongols conquered the Jin dynasty in northern China, swept through Russia, and pushed into Poland and Hungary, the farthest western extension of Mongol power in Europe. In the Middle East, a general named Chormakan subdued Persia and pushed into the Caucasus, reducing the Kingdom of Georgia to a vassal state, establishing Mongol presence within striking distance of Anatolia. The Seljuk sultans of Rum, watching all this from a cautious distance, initially chose diplomacy over defiance. Kaikubad I had correctly recognized the Mongol threat and sent envoys, paid modest tribute, kept communications open. It was a pragmatic decision from a pragmatic man. But Kaikubad died in 1237, and his son and successor was a different kind of man entirely. Kaikhosra II was young, proud, and surrounded by courtiers who told him what young, proud rulers always want to hear. He had inherited a strong sultanate and interpreted its strength as his own personal achievement, rather than the accumulated work of generations. When Urgedei Khan died in 1241 and the Mongol succession briefly fell into dispute, Kaikhosra saw opportunity where a wiser man would have seen temporary reprieve. He stopped paying tribute. He began reasserting Seljuk authority in border regions. He sent signals through his tone in diplomatic correspondence, through the treatment of Mongol envoys, that the Sultanate of Rum would not be managed from the outside. He believed, with the particular certainty of men who have not yet been seriously tested, that the Mongols did not want war with him, and that if they did want war, he could win it. The Mongols had seen this attitude before. They had a name for it. They called it an invitation. Baiju, who had inherited Khormakhan's command in the Caucasus, delivered the Mongol response with characteristic efficiency. In the winter of 1241, he attacked the border city of Erzurum. The inhabitants chose to resist. Erzurum fell. Its resistance was noted and answered in the Mongol way. In 1242, Baiju moved further into Seljuk territory, raiding, probing, testing. Kaikhosra responded by calling in every ally he could reach. The Empire of Trebizond, the Ayyubid Sultan in Aleppo, the Kingdom of Georgia in the north, Frankish mercenaries who fought for anyone who paid. By the spring of 1243, he had assembled an army that, on paper, looked overwhelming. What the paper did not capture was the difference between numbers that existed and numbers that would fight. The stakes in that summer of 1243 were enormous, and they cascaded outward in every direction. For Kaikhosra personally, the stakes were his throne and his legacy. Either he stopped the Mongols here, or he became the Sultan who lost Anatolia, and the history books would remember him as the man who destroyed what 5 generations had built. For the Sultanate of Rum, the stakes were existence itself. Not merely territory, but the entire civilization. The caravanserais and the madrasas, and the poets in Konya, and the merchants in Sivas, and the farmers in the valleys who had never thought much about Mongols, because Mongols had always been someone else's problem. For the wider Islamic world, the stakes were grimmer still, because the intelligent men in Baghdad and Cairo and Damascus understood something that Khosrow apparently did not, that the Seljuks of Anatolia were the last serious military power standing between the Mongol Western advance and everything that made Islamic civilization what it was. There was one more set of stakes, the ones nobody was thinking about in 1243 because nobody had reason to. The stakes that belonged to the future, to the possibility that would be released, like water through a broken dam when the Seljuk world shattered. The stakes that would eventually become, 600 years later, the Ottoman Empire that ruled from Baghdad to Budapest, from Algiers to Aden, that would claim the caliphate Baghdad was about to lose, that would do what the Seljuks failed to do and erect a durable Islamic civilization
on the ruins of a Christian empire. Those stakes were invisible in 1243. They would not remain invisible for long. The pass of Köse Dağ sits in the northeastern Anatolian highlands like a crease in the palm of a giant's hand, narrow, dramatic, flanked by slopes that rise sharply on both sides, threading between ridgelines that give any defending force a natural advantage so obvious it requires no military education to perceive. The Romans had known this ground. The Byzantines had known it. Every commander who had moved armies through this part of Anatolia for 2,000 years had understood that this was the kind of terrain where a smaller force in good position could hold against a larger force in the open. The pass was approximately 60 kilometers east of Sivas, sitting between that city and Erzincan further east, guarding the approach to the Seljuk heartland as effectively as any man-made fortification could. Köse had marched his army 320 kilometers north from Konya to reach this ground. That march itself represented a choice. The choice to go forward and meet the Mongols, rather than wait behind the walls of Sivas, or pull back to prepared positions further west. His experienced commanders had urged the defensive option. Hold in Sivas, they said. Let winter come. Force the Mongols to fight in terrain they do not know, against walls they cannot easily breach, in weather that would slow their supply lines. The argument was sound. It was also ignored. The army that Köse assembled was genuinely impressive in its raw numbers, genuinely diverse in its composition, and genuinely problematic in its coherence. At its core were the Seljuk cavalry, armoured horsemen trained in the heavy cavalry tradition that had dominated Middle Eastern warfare since the early Islamic period. Excellent individual fighters, whose effectiveness depended on coordinated action that required unified command. Supporting them were Georgian cavalry auxiliaries, veterans of their own struggles with the Mongols, and among the finest heavy horsemen in the region. The Empire of Trebizond contributed a contingent from the Black Sea coast. The Ayyubid Sultan in Aleppo had sent what forces he could spare. And mixed throughout the army were Frankish mercenaries, Western European knights and infantry who had drifted east through the Crusader states, men who fought with discipline and professionalism, and who had no particular emotional stake in whether the Sultanate of Rum survived. On paper, 60,000 to 80,000 men. In practice, in the terrible arithmetic of morale and loyalty that determines what an army actually is under stress, perhaps 20,000, who would hold when the critical moment came. The rest, and Köse could not have known this, could not have predicted the speed with which an army's cohesion dissolves once doubt enters the ranks, the rest would find reasons to leave before the fighting became decisive. Baiju knew exactly who he was facing. The Mongol intelligence network, built on fast riders, local informants, and the systematic interrogation of every prisoner taken, had given him a detailed picture of Seljuk forces, their composition, their morale, their commander's personality. He knew Köse was proud. He knew Köse was impatient. He knew Köse's experienced commanders were advising caution, and that Köse was not listening to them. These were not merely tactical facts. They were the key to the entire battle. Baiju had 30,000 men, perhaps 40,000 with auxiliaries, facing a numerically superior opponent on ground that favoured defence. He needed to change the geometry of the encounter. He needed to take what should have been a defensive battle and make it an offensive one. Not for his forces, but for the Seljuks. He needed Köse to come to him, on ground Baiju chose, in a manner Baiju controlled. The war council in the Seljuk camp happened in the days before the battle, and it was in that council chamber, whether it was a tent or a commandeered building, the sources do not specify, that the fate of Rum was actually decided, before a single arrow was fired, before a single horse charged across the pass. The experienced commanders presented their case methodically. The terrain favored a defensive posture. The Mongols' weakness, if they had one, was in extended operations against fortified positions. They preferred open field engagements, where their mobility could be exploited, where their feigned retreat tactics had room to operate. Hold. Wait. Starve them of the battle they wanted. Every strategic instinct, honed by a lifetime of warfare, pointed in the same direction. But strategy operates inside politics, and politics in the Seljuk court in 1243 operated inside the psychology of a young sultan surrounded by ambitious nobles, who had not seen what the older commanders had seen. The younger nobles spoke of honor. They spoke of the insult of waiting behind walls while Mongols rode through Seljuk territory. They spoke of what the army would think, what the people would think, what history would write about a sultan who hid from barbarians. They did not speak, because they did not know, because they had never had to know, about what happened to armies that abandoned good defensive ground to give mobile cavalry armies the open engagement those cavalry armies had been designed to win. Khosrau listened to the young men. He always listened to the young men. And so the Seljuk army, with all its flags and all its cavalry and all its mercenaries and all its hope, marched out of the good defensive ground and into the pass. The night before the battle was the kind of night that soldiers remember afterward, if they are still alive to remember anything. Along the Seljuk lines, fires burned in the June darkness, each one an island of warmth in the mountain chill that descends on high Anatolian ground, even in summer once the sun sets. Men prayed. The Muslim soldiers among them faced south toward Mecca, prostrating themselves on the rocky soil, asking for the intercession of God and the Prophet in language that men had been using to ask for protection before battles since the earliest days of Islam. The Frankish mercenaries had their own prayers, in Latin or Occitan or the dialects of the Rhineland, addressed to saints and the Virgin, carrying the particular weight of men praying far from home in a war that was not quite their own. The Georgian cavalry drank wine they had brought from the Caucasus, quietly, speaking little. There is a particular silence that descends on soldiers the night before a battle that everyone knows will be decisive. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of men who have run out of distractions and are left alone with the knowledge of what morning will bring. Across the valley, in the Mongol position, there were almost no fires. The Mongol camp at night before a major engagement was a different kind of organized darkness. Horses tended and fed, equipment checked and rechecked, riders reassigned to new formations based on intelligence received that evening. Baiju was already adjusting his deployment, already placing his vanguard where it would draw the Seljuk forward, already positioning his flanking units where they could swing closed once the trap was baited. His men were not praying, they were working. The Mongol military tradition did not distinguish between preparation and prayer. Readiness was its own form of devotion. The strategy Baiju had chosen was the one the Mongols had refined across 30 years of continental warfare. The feigned retreat that was not a retreat. The false vulnerability that was actually an invitation. The controlled collapse designed to transform the aggressor into the encircled. He would send forward a vanguard, visible, engaging, seemingly vulnerable. When the Seljuks attacked with their heavy cavalry, as their instincts and their pride demanded, the vanguard would give ground. It would give ground in a specific direction, drawing the Seljuk pursuit away from the defensive slopes and into the open, where Mongol flanking forces would close around them like a hand closing into a fist. The beauty of the trap was that it required the enemy's courage to function. The harder the Seljuks fought, the further they would chase, and the further they chased, the more completely surrounded they would become. All Baiju needed was for Kai-Khosra to be exactly the kind of commander that every report suggested he was. Kai-Khosra did not disappoint. Dawn came over Köse Dağ on June 26, 1243, with the particular clarity of high-altitude summer mornings, when the air has not yet been thickened by the heat of the day, and objects at great distances appear razor-sharp, as if the world is trying to make certain that everyone can see exactly what is about to happen.
The mountains on the horizon caught the first light and held it, amber turning to gold, the rocky slopes acquiring the temporary beauty that catastrophes sometimes dress themselves in before they reveal what they are. In the Seljuk lines, the sound began the way battle sounds always begin, not with the crash of contact, but with the accumulated noise of 80,000 beings in motion. Tens of thousands of hooves shifting on stone, the creak of leather harness, the metal-on-metal whisper of weapons being adjusted, shields being raised, helmets being settled. Horses blowing through their nostrils, a sound like weather, like a wind assembling itself, directionless and tremendous, filling the pass until there was no silence left anywhere inside it. The smell was horses and unwashed men, and the iron scent of armor that had been sitting in morning dew. The taste, for anyone whose mouth was open, was dust. The taste of Anatolia, dry and mineral, the taste of a place that had known war long before this army arrived. The Seljuk vanguard moved first, as Kai-Khosra had ordered, as the young nobles had demanded. Several thousand cavalry pushed forward into the narrowing throat of the pass, their banners bright against the shadowed slopes, their formation as disciplined as it ever would be, which was considerably less disciplined than what waited for them. The Mongol vanguard was visible across the valley floor, a line of horsemen, seemingly thin, seemingly containable, the kind of force that a commander looking at a numerical advantage might assess with satisfaction and conclude could be broken quickly. The morning phase of the battle was, by the accounts of those few who survived it and those who recorded their testimonies, surprisingly competitive. The Seljuk cavalry hit the Mongol vanguard with genuine force, and the Mongol horsemen did what they were supposed to do. They gave way. They fell back. Not in rout, not in panic, but in the controlled, deliberate retreat that the Mongol army had practiced into muscle memory across 10,000 miles of steppe and desert and mountain. They gave ground in precisely the direction Baiju had determined they would give it, pulling the Seljuk vanguard forward and to the left, drawing the momentum of the heavy cavalry in exactly the direction that the flanking units needed it to go. The Seljuk riders saw the Mongols retreating and felt what soldiers always feel when the enemy gives ground: the intoxicating conviction that they are winning. They pushed harder. They rode faster. They lost connection, step by step, with the units behind them, stretched the formation thin across ground that had seemed adequate for their numbers, but which was becoming increasingly inadequate as the pursuit extended and the flanks opened up. They were chasing a retreating enemy. They were certain they were about to break through. But the retreat was a door, and when they walked through it, the door closed. The Mongol flanking units that had been invisible, hidden in the folds of the terrain, behind ridgelines, in the dead ground that Baiju's reconnaissance had identified, swung out of concealment with the coordinated precision that made Mongol armies so terrifying to fight against. Not a ragged ambush, but a geometric operation. 2 arcs of horsemen sweeping inward from opposite sides, closing the gap behind the Seljuk vanguard and then beginning to constrict the circle around it. The encircled cavalry realized what was happening. Some fought with extraordinary bravery, pushing against the tightening ring, trying to break out. But bravery deployed inside a shrinking circle of Mongol archery is bravery that accomplishes nothing except dying in a particular direction. Within hours, perhaps 3,000 of the Seljuk vanguard were dead. The number is the one consistent across multiple sources, which suggests it has some reliability. But those 3,000 dead were not in themselves the catastrophe. The catastrophe was what they demonstrated to the remaining 50,000 men watching from further back in the Seljuk formation. What they demonstrated was that this enemy was not beatable. Armies break when they lose faith, not when they lose soldiers. Every army loses soldiers. But when the accumulated evidence of a single day or a single hour tells the rank and file that the commander has made a mistake, that the position is untenable, that the future consists entirely of varieties of dying. The Seljuk army had not been destroyed. It had been shown something, and what it had been shown was enough. The panic began at the edges, where the connection to the center was weakest, where individual soldiers could tell themselves that leaving was merely prudent repositioning rather than desertion. It spread inward. It spread upward through the command structure until it reached Kai Khosrow himself, who saw his army dissolving around him and made the decision that ended his reign as a serious historical actor. He ran. The Sultan of Rum fled toward Antalya on the Mediterranean coast, leaving behind the pass, his army, his viziers, and any remaining claim to be the man who would save Anatolia from the Mongols. Baiju watched the Seljuk camp empty from a distance, and his instincts, the instincts of a commander who had survived long enough to be suspicious of good fortune, told him to wait. A deserted enemy camp could be a trap. He waited. By morning, the trap hypothesis had been abandoned and the Mongol pursuit began, rolling through a landscape that had somehow become, overnight, a landscape with no government in it. Kayseri fell. Sivas fell. Erzincan had already submitted. The vizier Muhezibeddin, scrambling to save something from the collapse, found Baiju and offered terms. The terms were these: annual tribute of 12 million silver coins, 500 bolts of silk, 500 camels, 5,000 sheep. A Mongol Daragachi, an overseer, would be installed at the Seljuk court to ensure compliance. The Sultanate would continue to exist as a Mongol vassal. Its soldiers would be available for Mongol campaigns. Its taxes would flow eastward. Its Sultan would bow when Mongol messengers arrived. The Sultanate of Rum had ceased to be a sovereign state. It had become a tax collection mechanism wearing a crown. Now understand what that meant. Not immediately, not in the weeks and months following Köse Dağ, when the counting of dead and the negotiating of terms occupied everyone's attention. Understand what it meant across the following decades, as the implications of the Mongol conquest compounded and spread and began reshaping the human geography of an entire peninsula.
The first and most consequential effect was the one that happened quietly, invisibly, without formal announcement or official record. People moved. Masses of people, tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands. Turkic warriors and their families, Ghazi fighters, the holy warriors who combined religious fervour with military profession, craftsmen and scholars and minor administrators and local leaders whose identities and livelihoods had been tied to the Seljuk order that was now Mongol property. They looked east and saw occupation. They looked at their own villages and saw Mongol tax collectors arriving each season with the precision of weather. And they looked west, toward the frontier zones of western Anatolia that the Mongols had not yet penetrated deeply, toward the borderlands where Byzantine control was nominal and Seljuk authority was theoretical, and the land itself was essentially ungoverned. And they began to move. This migration was not an organized exodus. It was not a planned resettlement. It was the aggregate of thousands of individual decisions made by thousands of individual people and families and small tribal groups who had done the same calculation and reached the same conclusion. West was better than here. The Mongol pressure pushed them the way a millstone pushes grain, not as a single massive force, but as accumulated, relentless weight that brooked no standing still. In the period from the 1240s through the 1280s, Western Anatolia received a demographic infusion of extraordinary scale and military quality. The warriors among these migrants were not farmers who had picked up weapons out of desperation. They were professional soldiers, men who had trained for war since childhood, men whose entire identity was organized around mounted combat and Islamic faith. They brought their skills and their horses and their hunger for a place to belong, and their fury at what the Mongols had done to the world they had known. The Anatolian beyliks, the small principalities that began forming in western and northwestern Anatolia in the latter decades of the 13th century, were the institutional expression of this migration. When the Seljuk administrative structure weakened, when the Mongol overlords focused their attention on tax extraction rather than governance, local leaders filled the vacuum. Beys, tribal chieftains, military commanders, men who had earned loyalty through competence in the field, established small dominions in the areas where they could project force and attract followers. There were dozens of these entities, some no larger than a few valleys, some controlling significant stretches of coastline or mountain territory, each one a nucleus of organized Turkic power in a landscape that was desperate for organization. They employed Ghazi warriors fleeing from Persia and Turkestan. They attracted the displaced and the dispossessed and the ambitious. They provided what the Seljuk order in its Mongol vassalage could no longer provide: the possibility of something growing. But 15 years after Köse Dağ, the Mongols delivered a second blow. And this one struck at something far more fundamental than a sultanate. Baghdad, in the winter of 1257, did not know it was dying. The city that had been the intellectual capital of the Islamic world for 5 centuries, that housed perhaps 1 million people within its round walls, that had survived invasion and siege and internal political collapse and the slow hemorrhaging of caliphal power to Turkish sultans, Baghdad continued to function in December 1257 as it had functioned for generations. Scholars debated in the madrasas, merchants negotiated in the bazaars, The Caliph al-Mustasim performed his ceremonial functions with the dignity that 5 centuries of tradition demanded. And heading toward it, with an army so large that contemporary estimates become unreliable, certainly in the hundreds of thousands, came Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, with orders from his brother Munka to deal with the Abbasid Caliphate the way the Mongols dealt with entities that refused their authority. Hulagu had demanded submission. Al-Mustasim had refused. The Caliph, in his refusal, had made an argument that was theologically impeccable and strategically suicidal: that the entire Islamic world would rise to defend the seat of the Caliphate, that divine protection would supplement earthly armies, that a power that had endured for 500 years could not simply be ended by cavalry from the steppes. He sent dismissive letters. He failed to fortify the walls that repeated floods in the 1240s and 1250s had weakened. He did not summon the armies that his authority, at least nominally, could command. He trusted in the idea of Baghdad rather than the physical reality of its defences. Hulagu's forces reached the city on January 29, 1258.
The Mongol army was divided into columns that approached from both sides of the Tigris, cutting off escape routes and reinforcement routes simultaneously, enveloping the city the way the Mongol flanking movement had enveloped the Seljuk vanguard at Köse Dağ, with geometric patience, closing off option after option until the only remaining option was surrender or annihilation. The assault began in earnest at the end of January. Mongol siege engines, the product of Chinese engineering expertise that the Mongols had incorporated into their war machine in Asia, bombarded the walls systematically. By February 5th, the Mongols controlled a section of the eastern wall. Al-Mustasim, finally understanding what was happening, attempted to negotiate. Hulagu refused. There was nothing to negotiate. The time for negotiation had ended when the Caliph chose defiance. Baghdad surrendered on February 10, 1258. The Mongols entered the city 3 days later. What followed was a week that the medieval Islamic world remembered for centuries as the worst thing that had ever happened to it. The Mongols moved through the streets of Baghdad with the systematic efficiency that was their signature, killing, enslaving, and destroying according to a calculus that bore no relationship to the value of what they were destroying. The mosques burned, the schools burned, the libraries burned. And the burning of the libraries was not incidental damage, but essential policy. Because destroying the administrative and intellectual infrastructure of a conquered territory made that territory permanently dependent on Mongol governance. The Tigris, according to the chronicles written in the generation following, ran black with the ink of drowned books and red with the blood of drowned scholars. Whether the image is precisely literal or metaphorical does not diminish what it describes: the systematic extermination of accumulated human knowledge on a scale that had no precedent in Islamic history. Al-Mustasim was taken prisoner. The Mongols, following their custom that royal blood must not touch the earth, had him wrapped in a felt carpet and trampled to death by horses. The 37th Abbasid Caliph died on the ground of his own city, inside a carpet, while the city his dynasty had built burned around him. With him died 500 years of Abbasid caliphal authority. The institution that had given the Islamic world its central legitimating structure, the successor to the Prophet, the commander of the faithful, the anchor of Islamic political theology, was simply gone. A shadow caliphate would be established in Cairo under Mamluk patronage, technically preserving the lineage,
but everyone understood that it was theatre. The real thing was dead on February 13th, 1258, inside a carpet, beside a burning city. The political and spiritual vacuum that this created in the Islamic world cannot be overstated. For 5 centuries, questions of legitimacy, who had the right to rule, whose authority was valid, whose wars were holy wars, and whose were mere banditry, had ultimately been referred back to Baghdad. The Caliph's blessing made sultans legitimate. His recognition conferred authority that military power alone could not generate. Without the Caliph, the entire scaffolding of Islamic political theology had a hole at its centre, where the load-bearing column had been. Someone would eventually need to fill that hole. Something would need to be built that could bear the weight that Baghdad had borne. In 1258, nobody knew what that something would be. But the hole was there, waiting, for whoever proved strong enough and wise enough and well-positioned enough to step into it. Far to the northwest, in the western Anatolian highlands, a small bey named Ertuğrul of the Kayi tribe was administering a stretch of frontier territory that the Seljuk Sultan had assigned to him decades earlier. The border zone around the town of Söğüt, on the edge of Byzantine Bithynia. The Kay had come to Anatolia as part of the great westward migration of Oghuz Turkish tribes, pushed first by the Mongol expansion in Central Asia, then redirected and repositioned as the Seljuk administrative structure absorbed them and put them where they were needed. The Seljuks had needed someone to watch the Byzantine frontier. Ertuğrul had needed land. The arrangement served both purposes, and Söğüt, small, remote, strategically unimportant to anyone whose attention was fixed on Baghdad or Konya or the great trade routes, became the Kay home. Ertuğrul was old now, in the late 1250s. He had spent his life as the Seljuks needed him to spend it, fighting Byzantines on the frontier, maintaining order in his small territory, raising sons who could continue the work. He had not built an empire. He had built a reputation and a foundation, and a community of loyal warriors who understood that their future depended on whatever the next generation did with what this generation had prepared. In the year 1258, the exact same year that Baghdad fell, the same year that the Abbasid Caliph died in his carpet, the same year that the spiritual center of the Islamic world became a smoldering ruin, a child was born in Söğüt. His name was Osman. He did not know, obviously, what that year meant. He was an infant in a frontier town, the son of a minor tribal leader on the edge of an empire that was itself the vassal of an empire. He had no way of knowing that the world into which he had been born was simultaneously one of the most destroyed worlds in Islamic history and one of the most pregnant with possibility. A world where the old orders had been shattered so completely that new orders could grow in the gaps, where the displacement of hundreds of thousands of skilled warriors had populated the frontier zones with exactly the human material from which empires are made, where the destruction of Baghdad had created a spiritual vacancy that the right leader in the right position could eventually claim to fill. He could not have known any of this. He was an infant. But history does not require its protagonists to understand it while it is happening. It only requires them to be there. The accounting of catastrophe always begins with numbers, because numbers are what can be measured, and what can be measured creates the illusion that the full extent of the damage has been captured. At Köse Dağ, the dead on the Seljuk side numbered approximately 3,000 in the direct combat, a figure that appears consistently enough across multiple sources to carry some reliability.
3,000, against 80,000 who had marched. The arithmetic of the battle itself, measured in bodies on the field, was not a massacre. It was something more insidious, a demonstration, a proof of concept. 3,000 dead and 50,000 in flight was not a numerical catastrophe. It was a psychological one. The moment when an entire army looked at what was in front of it and decided, collectively and individually, that the calculation had changed. Khosrau II fled to Antalya on the Mediterranean coast, putting the maximum possible distance between himself and the consequences of his decisions. He never recovered his authority. The man who had dismissed the cautious advice of his experienced commanders, who had listened to the young nobles with their talk of honor, who had marched his army out of defensible ground into open terrain against an enemy that specialized in destroying forces that made exactly that mistake. He spent the remaining 3 years of his life in the political twilight that is the particular punishment of rulers who survive their own catastrophic decisions. He died in 1246, leaving 3 underage sons and a succession crisis that the Mongols exploited with practiced efficiency, supporting whichever son made them the most compliant puppet at any given moment. The battlefield at Köse Dağ, after the Seljuks fled and before the Mongols completed their pursuit, would have looked like all battlefields look in their aftermath, emptied of the noise and motion that had filled them hours before, littered with the evidence of human violence, weapons and harness, and the bodies of horses that had not survived the morning. The June sun, indifferent to human affairs, continued its arc across the sky. The mountains that had witnessed the battle looked exactly as they had looked when the armies arrived. The pass was the same. The slopes were the same. The grass, trampled and bloodied in places, was the same grass. But the political reality that had existed when sunrise came that morning did not exist when the sun set. A civilization's fate had pivoted on a June day, and the pivot had happened so quickly that the full weight of what had changed had not yet had time to make itself felt. The Mongol administrative apparatus moved into Anatolia with the same efficiency that had characterized the conquest itself. A darugachi, the Mongol term for the administrative overseer who ensured that conquered territories fulfilled their obligations, was installed at the Seljuk court in Konya. The tribute requirements were formalized and collection schedules established. The Seljuk Sultan continued to sit on his throne, continued to receive ambassadors and issue decrees, continued to be addressed by the titles that his dynasty had accumulated over generations. But the tribute flowed eastward. The military levies flowed eastward. The real decisions were made by Mongol officials who did not need to ask anyone's permission. The farther reaches of the Sultanate, the frontier zones in western Anatolia, where the Seljuk administrative presence had always been lightest, where local beys had always operated with considerable autonomy, began slipping from even nominal Seljuk control within years of Köse Dağ. The Mongols were not particularly interested in western Anatolia in the immediate aftermath of the battle. Their attention was fixed on more valuable prizes: the wealthy cities of the interior, the trade routes connecting Anatolia to Persia and the east, the agricultural surplus that could be extracted from the fertile river valleys. The Byzantine frontier was thin pickings by Mongol standards. They left it alone, or nearly alone, attending to it only when their vassals in the interior required occasional military reminders of who was in charge. This neglect was, in retrospect, the most consequential administrative decision the Mongols ever made in Anatolia. Not the conquest, not the tribute arrangements, not the installation of darugachis at court. The neglect of the West, the failure to project real power into the Byzantine frontier zones, to govern them directly, to prevent the formation of the political entities that were already beginning to coalesce in the spaces that Mongol governance did not fill. That neglect created the petri dish in which the Ottoman Beylik would grow. The Beyliks that formed in western Anatolia in the decades following Köse Dağ were not, individually, impressive entities. They were small, often poor, constantly engaged in competition with each other and raiding against Byzantine towns that were themselves struggling. Some lasted decades before being absorbed by neighbors. Some barely achieved coherent organization before dissolving. The landscape of western Anatolia in the 1270s and 1280s looked, to any observer familiar with the great empires of the age, like a collection of quarreling fragments with no future. Dozens of petty chiefs, each commanding a few hundred to a few thousand warriors, each claiming authority over a valley or a coastal strip or a mountain range, each presenting themselves as defenders of the faith against Byzantine Christianity, each attracting the wandering Ghazi warriors who had been displaced by Mongol conquest and who needed a cause and a commander to give their violence direction and their lives meaning. Among these dozens of beyliks, small and squabbling and seemingly inconsequential, was the beylik of the Osmanolu, the House of Osman. Centered on the town of Soğut in the region of Bithynia, positioned at the northwestern corner of Anatolia, where the mountains give way to the plains that slope down toward Constantinople, it was, by any measure, one of the least impressive entities in a landscape of unimpressive entities. Its territory was small, its treasury was modest, its army was a few thousand warriors at most. The great Byzantine city of Nicaea, Iznik, was barely 50 kilometers away, walled and garrisoned, a reminder that the Byzantine Empire, however weakened, still knew how to defend stone. Around 1281, Ertuğrul died at Soğut, and the leadership of the Kai tribe passed to his son. The name on the coins, when the beylik eventually had enough stability and confidence to mint them, which did not happen immediately, was Osman. Not the name of the Ilkhanate, not the name of the Seljuk Sultan. Osman, a declaration of identity, small in 1281, that would eventually become one of the most consequential names in the history of the world. The chain of causation that connects the Battle of Köse Dağ in 1243 to the Ottoman Empire that would eventually rule 3 continents is not a simple chain. It is braided, multiple strands twisted together, each one contributing tension and direction, none of them sufficient alone, but collectively forming something strong enough to bear the weight of 600 years of history. Strand 1. The demographic transformation. The Mongol conquest did not simply defeat the Seljuks. It deracinated hundreds of thousands of Turkic warriors and their families, pulling them out of the social and political structures that had organized their lives, and depositing them, through the mechanics of displacement and migration and the relentless westward pressure of Mongol expansion, into the frontier zones of western Anatolia. These were not passive refugees. They were professionals in violence, men trained since childhood in the skills of mounted warfare, men whose entire cultural identity was organized around the combination of Islamic faith and military capability that produced the Ghazi warrior tradition. They needed a cause. They needed a leader. They needed a direction to point their skills and their faith and their hunger. The beylik system gave them all 3. And when the Ottoman beylik proved, through its string of victories against Byzantine forces, that it was the cause most likely to succeed, the warriors flowed toward it with the logic of water flowing downhill. Strand 2. The political vacuum.
The Mongol destruction of the Seljuk state and the simultaneous weakening of Byzantine power created a landscape where the old equilibrium had been permanently disrupted. Western Anatolia in the late 13th century had no dominant power, no settled hierarchy of authority that could prevent the rise of new entities. The Ilkhanate controlled the east and center of Anatolia, but critically not the northwest, not the Bithynian frontier where Osman's Beylik was taking shape. Osman was able to grow precisely because the major powers were looking elsewhere. The Mongols looked east, toward Persia and their continuing wars with the Mamluks. The Byzantines looked west, toward their recovered capital at Constantinople and the continuous political crises that consumed their attention. No one was watching the corner of Anatolia where a tribal chieftain was quietly building something. Strand 3. The spiritual vacancy that Baghdad's fall had created. When Hulagu Khan killed al-Mustasim and burned the House of Wisdom, he did not simply destroy a city. He destroyed the institution through which Islamic political legitimacy had been organized for 5 centuries. The question of who had the right to lead the Islamic world, a question that had always been answered, at least formally, by reference to the Abbasid Caliphate, was suddenly open. The Ottoman sultans would not immediately claim to answer it, but they created the conditions from which an answer could emerge. As they grew, as they proved capable of protecting and expanding the Dar al-Islam, as they demonstrated military effectiveness against the Christian powers that threatened it, they accumulated a legitimacy that was not caliphal in form, but was increasingly caliphal in function. When Selim I conquered Cairo in 1517, and the last shadow caliph transferred his authority to the Ottoman Sultan, it was the formalization of something that had been building for 2 centuries. The Ottoman claim to be the true successors of what Baghdad had been, the restorers of what the Mongols had destroyed. In 1299, or thereabouts, the exact date is less fixed than tradition suggests, Osman declared his independence from the Seljuk nominal authority that had already ceased to mean anything. He was not, at that moment, an emperor. He was a bey, with a few thousand warriors and a town and a reputation growing from the raids he had been conducting against Byzantine territory. But he had something that distinguished him from the other beys quarrelling over western Anatolia: a position. The Bithynian frontier was the one place where an ambitious leader could expand without immediately colliding with the Mongols in the east or the other major beyliks in the south. The only direction was west, into Byzantine territory, into the lands of the Christian Empire that every Ghazi warrior understood as the enemy of the faith, into the regions that the flow of displaced and devout fighters was already pointing toward. The Battle of Baphius in 1301 or 1302 was the moment when the Ottoman Beylik became something qualitatively different from its neighbors. Osman led his forces against a Byzantine army that had come to stop the raids, and he won, decisively, publicly, in a way that could not be minimized or explained away. Word traveled. Warriors arrived. The Beylik that had been one of dozens became, after Baphius, the Beylik that was winning. And in the brutal competition of the Anatolian frontier, nothing attracted followers like the visible fact of success. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum dissolved completely in 1308, its last sultan dead and its territories formally absorbed into the Ilkhanate. Nobody mourned it very loudly. The Ilkhanate itself fractured and collapsed in 1335, its last effective ruler dead without a competent successor, its administrative structure disintegrating into the competing ambitions of regional commanders. Both of these events, the Seljuk disappearance and the Ilkhanate collapse, removed constraints that had limited Ottoman expansion.
After 1308, Osman owed nominal allegiance to nothing. After 1335, his successors faced no Mongol power capable of disciplining them. What followed is one of the most extraordinary trajectories in the history of state formation. Osman's son Orhan captured Bursa in 1326, giving the Ottomans their first major walled city and their first real capital, the first proof that they were not simply a raiding entity, but a governing one. Orhan's son Murad I crossed into Europe, establishing Ottoman presence in Thrace and the Balkans in 1354. Murad's son Bayezid I earned the name Thunderbolt for the speed of his campaigns, which brought Ottoman forces to the walls of Constantinople for the first time. And then, in 1453, Mehmed II, the seventh direct successor of Osman, born 195 years after the year that Baghdad burned and Osman entered the world, brought his army to those walls with the largest cannon that had ever been cast, and broke them. Constantinople fell on May 29, 1453, and Mehmed rode into the city that the Byzantine Empire had held for 1,000 years. He visited the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in the Christian world, and had the call to prayer issued from its minarets. He was 21 years old. He was the heir of a tribe that had arrived in Anatolia as refugees from Mongol pressure, had been given a patch of frontier land that nobody else wanted, had grown in the gaps that Mongol destruction had created, and had spent 2 centuries doing precisely what the Ghazi tradition demanded of it. He had completed what Köse Dağ had made possible. He had restored what Baghdad's burning had made necessary. He had filled the hole that the Mongols had left in the center of the Islamic world. And he had done it from the most improbable beginning imaginable. A small tribe, a frontier town, a child, born in the year everything broke. The pass of Köse Dağ is quiet now. The mountains that watched the Seljuk army dissolve in June of 1243 are still there, unchanged, patient. The rocky slopes still catch the morning light in amber and gold. Sheep graze where cavalry charged. The wind that moves through the pass carries no memory of what it witnessed, no record of the turning point that happened there, no knowledge of what the day's events set in motion across the following centuries. In Siirt, the small town in northwestern Turkey where Ertuğrul established his beylik and Osman was born, there is a mausoleum. It has been rebuilt many times. The current structure dates to the late 19th century, built by the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II as a monument to the dynasty's origins. Every year, the town holds a festival to commemorate Ertuğrul and the early Ottomans, drawing visitors who come to stand at the beginning of the story and try to grasp, standing in a quiet Anatolian town, how much followed from how little. The Mongols came to destroy. They were extraordinarily good at it. They destroyed the Sultanate of Rum and Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate and the political order of an entire civilization and the lives of millions of people whose names we will never know. They were thorough and efficient and relentless, and by most measures they succeeded at what they set out to do. But destruction, unlike creation, does not get to decide what grows in the space it clears. The Mongols shattered a world, and in the fragments, in the displaced warriors and the wandering scholars and the frontier beyliks and the unanswered question of who would lead the Islamic world now that Baghdad was gone, something assembled itself that the Mongols never intended and could not have predicted. Something that would outlast the Ilkhanate by 3 centuries. Something that would claim the caliphate the Mongols had destroyed. Something that would stand at the gates of Vienna and rule from the Sahara to the Carpathians, and stamp its identity on a quarter of the Earth's surface. The greatest empire the Islamic world ever produced was not built by conquerors. It was built by survivors, by the people who ran from the storm and found, at the far edge of running, a piece of ground nobody else wanted, and decided that here, in this forgotten frontier, in this overlooked corner, in this crack in the broken world, they would plant something and see what grew. Centuries later, we know what grew.